One of the most common problems in cosplay is that your design has some really specific logo, decal, pattern, or design that you can't just buy and need to custom make. A lot of the time you can tackle that with just like paint or markers. There's a ton of different valid and clever ways to accomplish this task. So we're going to compare 3 different ways to do custom designs with the iconic J Scott Campbell Mary Jane cover as an example. Hey, I'm Hendo, by the way, and I'm going to cover how to do a printed t-shirt transfer, heat transfer vinyl with a Cricut machine, and the good old-fashioned stitch and fabric method. I've made a pattern that you can download with the link below. It'll take you to a public Patreon post because I still haven't made my website, but you don't have to be a member to see it. This is how I host most of my free patterns. They're just public Patreon posts for now. Okay, let's craft. First, let's cover the quickest and easiest method, the t-shirt transfer. This has to be done with an ink printer and not a laser printer. You'll have to mirror your image if it isn't symmetrical, but ours is symmetrical, so no worries on that. The result isn't necessarily the cleanest. You kind of have to be careful with it, but it does get the job done and will last a few wears. It doesn't look amazing when compared to the other 2 methods side by side, but on its own, especially on a white garment, it's gonna read well enough on camera for a photo shoot especially. So let's walk through the t-shirt transfer method. I'm using the Avery brand for light color textiles. Print the image on the film coated side of the transfer paper. Usually the other side has markings so that you don't confuse the 2. Make sure you feed the paper in the correct direction into your printer. For most of these cheap at-home printers, the blank side should be face up. I'm actually cutting it out wrong here. You should leave a little bit of room around the edges of your design instead of cutting it out directly on the edges like I am. But I'm gonna fix that later because I'm gonna reprint it also. We'll get to that later. Okay, so let's position this onto our shirt. I think that the size is fine as is, and I'm just gonna indicate where I'm gonna iron it on by putting some sewing pins in. If you're aiming to show a little more cleavage, which is actually more accurate, you might want to place it lower so that the eyes are still visible when you cut the shirt lower. Okay, so now I'm reprinting my design because the first one came out pretty pink and stripy, and also I cut it out wrong. So I changed the image settings to work with the CMKY color settings of most printers instead, and that's already in the image file, so don't worry about adjusting it. Up top is the reprint, and on the bottom is the previous one. And you can see I cut this one out properly, giving a bit of space around the edges of the design. Try not to have any super pointy or sharp corners. Even the bottom of this heart, I'm rounding out this point a little bit to help it avoid lifting up later. Now we can iron this on, and remember, do not use the steam. It'll cause the ink to bleed. Usually the instructions say to preheat your fabric by ironing it. Then the design goes face down onto your fabric, and this transfer paper included tissue paper as an ironing sheet. My instructions say to apply pressure and heat for 2 whole minutes, and my design is big, so we're gonna have to do that a couple times. Let it cool completely before this next part. I'm time skipping. Then peel off this backing, which as you can see I'm having a little bit of a hard time doing, but I picked it up and got the bottom started, and then whee, there it goes. Hold the design down as you go, especially if your garment is stretchy. You're gonna be able to tell pretty easily if some parts didn't transfer or set into the fabric correctly, and if that's the case, just lay it down again and give it another go with the iron. You can see that I have a little spot here at the top that peeled off, but I lined up my sheet again, ironed it more, and that actually looks fine now. And boom, you're good to go. Honestly, this looks quite decent, and I used this method for a really long time before I had invested in some more of my expensive equipment. I've even taken a printed design with me and ironed it on at my hotel near a con so that I didn't have to worry about it crumpling during travel. Overall, this is a very quick and cheap method. Now let's talk about the cleanest method, which is using heat transfer vinyl, which is often abbreviated as HTV. I'm using a Cricut machine to cut this out, but you can use another brand like Silhouette, or you can actually even cut it out by hand. The hardest part of this method is making the digital file because Cricut Design Space is a hell on earth. For our classic MJ design, we're gonna need 3 different colors of HTV or iron on vinyl: red, black, and white for each of our 3 SVG files, the heart base, outlines, and the eyes. So open up Cricut Design Space, go to Canvas, and upload the image, resizing it if you need to. Click Make, and you'll see a preview of your cutout. And here you're gonna select your settings, like the machine type and the cutting board size. If the image wasn't symmetrical, you'd want to put mirror mode on. I think sometimes it does that automatically, but it doesn't matter in this case. Then click Continue, and go to Load your Cricut machine. Take your HTV and place it glossy side down onto the sticky mat. Load your mat, Then click the Cricut button and it'll start cutting. When it's done, pull it out and cut around your design, and of course save the leftovers. They're always useful. It's hard to see on camera, but you can kind of make out these cut lines. And so now we're going to remove what we don't want to transfer through a process called weeding. And I'm using this pointy tool that came with my Cricut machine. Super satisfying. Okay, cut out the other two pieces. The black is gonna take the longest due to all of the line work, and it's also gonna take the longest to weed. Side note, if you see it like break up your shape into a bunch of smaller pieces, go back, click on your image, and then select attach. That like sticks it to the board so that it won't rearrange. If you're having a hard time seeing the cut lines so that you know what to weed off, try hanging a lamp like directly overhead, and that'll make it a little easier to see the lines. Also, this is before I realized that it would be much easier to line everything up if I just made this part that included the black frames, but you see, I fixed that later, and that's in the pattern, so it's good to line stuff up as you go just to make sure everything is sized correctly. And once again, try on your shirt to visualize where your design needs to go and mark that off with pins or tape or whatever works. Now you can iron each piece on, starting with the bottom red layer. It helps a bit to pre-iron your fabric before ironing it on, then add the heart. The matte side should be towards the fabric and the glossy, like visible side should be face up. You can iron directly on this glossy clear vinyl, pressing for like 10 or 15 seconds. And if you have a home iron, you want that to be like between the cotton and wool setting. Then wait a few minutes for it to cool completely. If you peel while it's warm, you may end up lifting the vinyl design also, and then you kind of have to like go back and iron it again and just wait for it to cool off. Now the outline layer goes on, just line it up, and again you can put the iron directly on the clear glossy layer. Wait for it to cool completely before peeling. Go a little slower with this part because the line work like has a lot of edges and corners, and also you might want to bask in how satisfying this process is. It's the little things in life, you know? Finally, add the white eye layer. This piece is a bit smaller, so I'm going to take one of the peeled off glossy bits from before and put that back on so that my iron isn't directly on the heat transfer vinyl. That can tend to like burn the vinyl off, and that sucks, so just avoid that. Oh, the peel is so nice. And once your whole design is done, you can lay a piece of like tissue paper or like a cloth or something and give it one good quick iron to smooth everything out. And this method gives a very, very clean result. Mine's also kind of shiny, but I think there's more matte versions of the iron-on vinyl that you can buy. I just have really limited options here in Norway. And this tends to hold up to washing really well, and even if some corners start to peel up, you can usually iron them back down again. I think the main downside is that it looks a bit stiff and synthetic looking, but that's mostly an issue in person. Again, for photo shoots and more digital content, it's gonna be fine. And actually, that's only the downside if you don't count making the actual digital file, because that is the worst and drained all of my mana. It took me like a few hours. There's just a lot of settings with like Adobe Illustrator and then trying to transfer that to Cricut Design Space. And hopefully you can avoid doing the digital file. But anyway, that's how you do the heat transfer vinyl method, which is also what I'm wearing. I personally like the more homemade organic method of fabric and embroidery. Obviously you can use an embroidery machine, but those are pretty expensive and I don't have one, so we're just gonna do it by hand. This is the sturdiest and lasts the longest and is actually probably the cheapest without requiring any fancy equipment or tools. First, I printed out my design and figured out whereabouts I wanted it to be on my shirt. Then I cut out my red cotton fabric. Make sure you use a non-stretch red fabric because we're gonna stitch the web line work, and that's not gonna look good on a stretch fabric. Trying to do a satin stitch on stretch fabric will make you go insane. You can see that this fabric is pretty thin, so I'm gonna stabilize it a bit with some iron-on interfacing. I'll put the exact type down below, but this is the kind where like one side has those little adhesive dots that will glue to the fabric when you iron it on. So the dotted side needs to be face down on the fabric, and then it needs a damp cloth on top. Then use the iron by pressing firmly and holding it there for a few seconds. Once this fabric is stabilized, I'm gonna transfer on my design. You can use a water-soluble marker like I am here, and this will stay on until you wash it off with warm water. You can also use chalk or even a pen if you want, because all the markings should be covered by like your stitch work in the end. You can mark where the web lines connect and mark the middle and use a ruler or just sort of freehand it, but I prefer to trace it because it's easier and faster. This is an LED board, which is surprisingly cheap. It's like $10, but you can also use your computer monitor or laptop screen the same way. I actually do that the most often because I hate using my printer, and it's actually way easier to resize stuff like on your computer monitor in real time, at least for the small stuff. As long as your screen is mostly white and wherever you are is fairly dimly lit, this method works really well. I recommend taping it in place so it doesn't shift around. Don't use a permanent marker or anything that might bleed through to your screen. So this looks pretty good, and now we can stitch the line work. You can do this with a hoop and like hand embroidery, but this is before I had much experience with that, so I decided to just carefully satin stitch the lines. A satin stitch looks like a bunch of straight lines stitched really close together, and this is done with the zigzag stitch setting. Even the most basic machines usually have this stitch. On my machine, it's number 12. You can also adjust the width and the density of the stitch with these other settings. You'll want the length or density to be around 0, making the lines really close together. If you set it to 2 or more, you'll probably be able to actually see the zigzag or lightning bolt shape. You can see on my machine, it even has a picture of a buttonhole because that also uses a satin stitch. The width is up to you. This affects like how thick the line will look. My setting is on 2. I recommend you take an extra piece of fabric, also with that iron-on interfacing to stabilize it, and just practice a few of these satin stitches first. I apparently didn't film actually doing the stitch for this, but here is an insert of me doing the same thing on something else. You'll notice I'm also not really stitching the web lines where the eyes are going to cover them. You might have some little gaps or crookedness, but I genuinely think that that makes it look like more cute and homemade, and you also will not be able to tell from more than like a foot away. So now let's do the eyes. You can do this with white fabric and a satin stitch, or you can do this the quick and lazy way by just using like a stretchy white fabric that won't fray on the edges. I've cut out the eye shape from my pattern and I'm pinning it on just to cut it out. I folded the fabric in half just to cut out both at once, but do that at your own peril. Now I have 2 little eye lenses. Then I pinned each of these onto the black stretch fabric and just did a regular straight top stitch in white to secure them down. Now that the white part is stitched down, we can cut out the black frames. I actually cut out the frames from the pattern and placed it like around the white part, and then just pinned the paper to the fabric and cut it out. You can also use chalk to outline it or just eyeball it, whatever works for you. Then flip the paper pattern over to the other eye to do the same thing. This way it'll match exactly. Or freeball it, go wild. And now we pin these eyes to the webbed heart, then stitch them down with another simple straight top stitch in black. Look how cute it is! Now we can cut the heart out and give it an outline. You can also do that with a satin stitch, but I'm gonna use this bias tape because I love bias tape. This is the 1/4 inch double fold bias tape, and for the top pointy bit, I just cut it at an angle and burned the inner edge. Then I pin it all the way around before sewing it down to the heart with a black straight top stitch. I do this 1/2 at a time, and this is how the whole thing turned out. I like doing it this way because in case I don't want to make it again, it's easier to unstitch this from like whatever the garment is, in this case a hoodie. I can just like unstitch it instead of like undoing a satin stitch, which is a pain in the butt and puts way more holes in the edge of your design. I'm taking a Q-tip dipped in water and just removing any of those marker tracings that are still showing. You can also run the whole thing underwater. Obviously that's a lot easier, but then I'd have to wait for it to dry, and I really wanted to sew it on and I'm not that patient. Okay, so time to pin the emblem on, which again I like to do while actually wearing my garment. Don't forget to move your arms around and make sure that you still like the placement. Then just pin it in place before doing a final black top stitch to secure it to the shirt or jacket. So here's the final look. I think it is so cute and comfy. We're also going to ignore that tiny thread that I forgot to trim. It haunts me at night, but you can comment about it anyway. I absolutely love this, and I really like that it's like a little crop hoodie. That's it for making custom emblems for garments. All of these are fun and valid ways to cosplay. This is how they all look next to each other. You can see they actually all look pretty different when they're directly next to each other, but on their own, honestly, I don't think you can tell as much of a difference in quality. You can do this for any of the other Spidey designs like Venom or Gwen or Miles. I did Miles. Have fun with it. If you have a couple extra bucks to spare, please consider supporting me on Patreon, which is also where you can find the pattern for this J Scott Campbell Mary Jane design. See you next time and stay crafty. Thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon, especially my top tier patrons, Ricky Rod 33, Mike D, Andrew Leo, Grant Valentine, Robert Reyes, Turner, Nips 86, Mickle, Josh M, Schottenwolf, and Adam Trubiano. Thanks!